Very special session. This is the annual Distinguished Lecture, a prestigious lecture that happens each year at AERA. One scholar is selected to give the Distinguished Lecture, and I'm just absolutely proud as the president of AERA this year, Deborah Ball, to have had the opportunity to ask Bill Trent to give this year's Distinguished Lecture. Before I introduce Bill, I'd like to make a couple of comments and then introduce him to you, although I know that for many of you he does not need an introduction. First, I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge the space in which this meeting is taking place. We recognize that here in the city that we call New York, this is actually Lenape land. This is the land that is the homeland of the Lenape Nation. It's also the land to which the Shinnecock and the Haudenosaunee nations have often traveled since time immemorial. While many different groups have occupied this land and stood here on this site, we must remember all the time that we're here, that we're guests on this land, and this was and this is indigenous land. We must honor this land and the waters that surround it, and we must honor the people whose land it is. Please join me in a round of applause just to help ourselves remember to acknowledge it. I'd also ask that you, throughout the time that you're at this meeting, that you recognize the many people whose labors are making possible the work we're doing at this meeting. The people who have organized the AV in this room, for example, the people who are ensuring that we have chairs in the room, the people who are organizing all kinds of things that actually get erased by our taking for grantedness of the kinds of things that it takes for a huge meeting like this to take place and the facilities in which this is operating. So if you could join me by whenever you see people who are workers, who are staff members, in the hotels, wherever you go, if you could just take a moment to say good morning, good afternoon to people, ask them how their day is going, and thank them for their work, I would really appreciate it. And now I'd like to take a few moments to introduce today's speaker. It's really my great pleasure to introduce William Trent. Bill is a sociologist and education policy expert. He's widely recognized for his commitment to the improvement of educational practice in the American primary and secondary schools. His groundbreaking work on equity in education and his repeated service as an expert. Dr. Trent's scholarship on education inequality has focused on the benefits and consequences of school desegregation, and I know we'll be talking about that today. The social organization of schools, status attainment research, co- and extracurricular activities, and comparative education. In addition to his long tenure as a scholar and a teacher, Dr. Trent has contributed research and expertise to many boards and commissions, including the Higher Learning Commission, the Social Science Research Council, the National Research Council, the Kellogg Forum on Higher Education, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Research Advisory Committee, the Higher Education Policy Advisory Board, and the National Academy of Sciences Board on Testing and Assessment. From 1994 to 1999, Dr. Trent oversaw campus diversity issues as the Associate Chancellor of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Trent has received many honors throughout his career, including recognition from the Spencer Foundation, which made him a Spencer Resident Fellow, the Fulbright Program, which chose him as a Fulbright Senior Specialist, and the American Educational Research Association, which named him as an Outstanding Scholar in 1999. I'm really honored that Dr. Trent accepted my invitation to speak with us today and to share his perspectives. I chose him for many reasons, but among them that every single time I have an opportunity to interact with Dr. Trent, whether informally or having the opportunity to hear him speak as we will today, I learn things about his amazing capacity to take the longer and broader view, to remind us of the role of histories of all kinds in our current space, to think about the wide range of kinds of things we call data and evidence in a time where we're assaulted with things that people purport to be truths that clearly are not, but also debates within our own profession of what constitutes evidence and whose truths count. Bill is somebody who manages to put his arms around those complexities and to tackle questions that for many may be uncomfortable, but are absolutely essential to our ongoing learning and our opportunities to discuss with one another. I hope that out of this talk, we not only, I know, will learn more things, but that it will provoke us to have conversations that we must be having, that we must be learning to have, and that can inform and animate the work that has to be done. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Trent to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I have a lot of reasons to be humbled by this, not the least of which is that I know so many of you, and I am deeply appreciative of your choosing to take your Saturday afternoon, one of the prettiest that's been in New York in a long time, come sit through this. I'm not going to introduce family members who are here, but I will tell you that if you're the parent or grandparent of a teenage son, and the young lady that has been calling your house chooses to go to his baptism, she's not stalking him, she's got plans for him. The young lady I'm referring to is my wife, Mildred Trent. She is here in the audience. My daughter, who most of the time passes as my supervisor, is also here in the audience, Raynika Trent. She's also a U of I grad. I am really honored to have been awarded this opportunity to deliver the 2008 AERA Distinguished Lecture. I've been a member of AERA for a very long time. In many ways, I've grown up here in AERA with good friends like Joe Mills, Walter Allen, Edgar Epps, both senior and junior members who have meant so much in my life. I took a look at the education leaders who have gone before me in this role. That's a really impressive list. And to be added to that list is indeed an honor. Thank you, President Deborah Ball, and those who worked with you to convince you that you should do this. I really do appreciate it. It is indeed quite an honor to do this. So I'll get started. There are a lot of people who are concerned that he usually talks too long. There were rumors that if I were to invite Phil Bowman into a room, most people close the door and don't bother to come back for a while because Phil and I have been known to have pretty long conversations. So what I'm going to try to do today is to talk about work that is both personal to me because of my own experiences and is a part of much of the work that I've done as a professional. So the title of the lecture is Interrogating Segregation, Its Complexities and Its Consequences for Public Education. I use an institutional framework as a way to understand segregation. Doing so deepens my understanding of the persistence and pervasiveness of segregation. The complexity of segregation today acknowledges the way in which segregation that increases the concentration of Black and brown students and poverty in neighborhoods and schools has interactions that intensifies the educational cost of segregation to those communities and to our nation at large. I also believe that for decades now, we have undercut our efforts to develop sound policy in addressing segregation by spending an insufficient amount of time and effort building a more complete conceptualization of integration and what it would take to achieve it. We needed early on to be able to be clearer, more precise about what it would look like, sound like, and feel like, especially for the students who would be expected to grow and develop in those newly desegregated classrooms. We needed to be able to explain to teachers how to grow those desegregated classrooms into integrated classrooms and how they might know when it was or was not working. We can safely assume that in 1954, there were few spaces we could send people into and have them observe an integrated space, classroom or workplace. Some might argue that the military, after Truman's executive order in 1948, integrating the military, offered such an environment. But that is difficult to substantiate given the experiences of the Tuskegee Airmen as just one example of the long-run inequality and segregation in the military. Reading the language of Truman's executive order, and I'll see how well I do at this. There you are. Reading the language in Truman's executive order desegregating the military, there are several pieces that are pretty striking to me, beginning with the tone and the order that seem to assume that everyone, or at least someone, knew what the change should look like and feel like. It was stated so matter-of-factly. Look also at the easy interchange between desegregation and integration, particularly in the last sentence. So interrogating segregation should help us understand just what it is we are working to dismantle and the challenges that work presents. In short, segregation is an institution in this society. Sociologists refer to such institutions as the established practices in the social and political life of a people. Think of it like academic freedom, only stronger. Dismantling institutions is no light thing, nor should it be. Sumner called these crescent institutions, slow-growing but evolving. Give you one example of that. See, we had tracking in my all-black schools too.
To those whose purpose and design is to blend and amalgamate the white and Negro race and destroy the integrity of both races. To those who disclaim that they are integrationists but are working day and night to integrate the schools. To those who don't care what happens to the children of Virginia. To those false prophets of a literal or token integration.
I'll be able to come back to it. As a 13-year-old in 1957, Governor Allman in Virginia, when he was running for, he was running for governor in Virginia in 1957. He became governor in 1959. His campaign speech was loaded with statements about those of us who claim to appreciate morality, but yet be willing to pursue integration while sending their own children to segregated schools. There are about 10 statements like that, and the last one of which I remember was, "Over my dead body will they desegregate the schools in the state of Virginia." It's an impressive lesson for a 13-year-old. And if I get a chance to play it, you'll get to hear what sounds like almost the venom dripping from his speech. But even more so, there remains an even greater challenge in answering the question of what next in addressing the persistent issue of segregation, especially in the present context of demographic change, the rapid growth of suburbs and ethnoburbs, and the emerging evidence on potentially competing motivations driving segregation. That speech in 1959 reflects a period in time when the racial structure, the racial hierarchy, made it clear that the issue of segregation that Governor Allman was speaking to was a real one to which people had deep and strong commitments. It was the resistance of whites to race mixing That was the social, political, moral, and policy issue. It addressed the question of access to quality education as a matter of the rights of citizenship, as I understand it. It centered on the clearly expressed idea and goal of equal opportunity and equal educational opportunity. It was the black-white dichotomy, which we have thankfully moved beyond. As a result, the concern to researchers trying to enable reasonable and healthy policies has centered on improving a lot of Blacks and more recently Hispanics. The set of questions arising from this goal have challenged the research community to develop the best and most informative measures of segregation, usually conceptualizing it along the traditional black-white dichotomy. With the benefit of several advances in theoretical conceptualization, measurement, and statistical analysis, we have the benefit of far more refined analyses and understandings of segregation, residential segregation, school segregation, the importance of understanding, the importance of measures of isolation as compared to measures of dissimilarity, each taking into consideration the impact of family poverty, community poverty, regional poverty, and policy. Throughout, the concern most have had has been on the role of segregation in reducing or limiting the in reducing or limiting or constraining the targets of this history and exercise of segregation in shaping the quality of life for those targets and their children. That much has not changed. I think we have to remain committed to that, the removal of those constraints. It remains as the evidence of such impact are revealed as persisting. It is, however, necessary and beneficial that we have more comprehensive and arguably more sensitive methods of thinking about and measuring persistent inequalities. These advances in science matter. As a community of scholars and researchers, we need to embrace those advances in our capabilities employ these evolving conceptualizations and techniques in our practice, and become more fluent in their appropriate uses. Many of the scholars that produce these advances are here today. Certainly they're a part of AERA and a part of the broader community of scholars who focus on this work. In preparation of this talk, I benefited greatly from that body of work, although admittedly, you may not see it as a major thread or feature in this presentation. I have chosen to deliver on a smaller but still crucial piece of this persisting problem. Does segregation, however we measure it, persist? If so, how has it been intensified by the commensurate increases in poverty? That is my intent. This is an interesting context in which to be giving this talk, not just the city and state of New York, but the past month and what we have been commemorating. 64 years post-Brown, 50 years post the Kerner Report, and 50 years post the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. I am a graduate of the segregated public schools of Richmond, Virginia. Completed high school in 1962, before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. some 5 years before the schools in the city were desegregated in 1967. I attended school and lived in a Jim Crow city. As many of you know, Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, and I'd like to say most of the people there were proud of it. In 1957, again referencing that speech by Allman, hearing the part about over his dead body would they desegregate the schools in the state of Virginia really obviously has had a lasting impact on me. And I can't get those words out of my head. They did desegregate the schools in the state of Virginia. Not for long, but they also closed the schools in Prince Edward County and kept them closed, and whites used the money from those schools to build Christian academies, segregated schools for whites. I have served on the committee at University of Illinois, the young woman who is now chair of a department at Howard University whose parents were victims of that school closing. It is also the case that I had some of the most able teachers a student could possibly have in any place at any time as a result of that discrimination that prevailed at the time. My African-American high school teacher, math teacher, science teachers became university faculty following the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the beginnings of increased opportunities. They were very bright and talented educators. They were also members of the same community I came of age in. There were class differences, to be sure, but segregation constrained its influence. We all lived in the same community. Most importantly, those educators taught me in a way that makes the question of whether or not black children can be taught to high standards and perform at high levels quite peculiar to me. Because I had classmates who blew me away. As such, my response to questions about expectancy for African American performances in school is usually that most schools are dramatically underperforming for today's students who fit my profile. Cyril Walker is doing excellent work, or has done excellent work, to talk about those teachers and how important they've been in the lives of so many of us. The educational inequalities that existed at that time were indeed real. The resource differences to the forced absence from school as part of the agrarian labor force. It's what you get when you work with Jim Anderson. There were school-to-school differences in Richmond between classrooms, within schools, and certainly between the city schools in Richmond and the rural schools nearby and across the state. Nonetheless, there were educators who taught me and others to a vision of accomplishment that I could not fashion for myself. And they were unrelenting in their commitment to my development. I've always been amazed that those teachers would work diligently enough to prepare us for a society that they might not even see, one in which we would reap the benefits of their excellence. Following graduation from high school, I enrolled in Union College in Barberville, Kentucky. Now, you may be wondering where this is going. And I went there on a basketball scholarship, and I became one of 4 African-American students on campus and one of 6 blacks. At no time during my undergraduate years did African-American enrollment exceed 6. And at all times, no fewer than 3 were on that basketball team. It was at Union that I learned the power of ignorance that accompanies segregation. It was a very penetrating learning experience for me. It was then that I learned the value also of a diverse learning environment and the significance of adult leadership and responsibility in such environments, and how important and beneficial they were going to be, especially to Black students. Had a teammate that was hung in effigy outside of a young white woman's class or dorm room. I had a teammate who came to me with that same kid standing literally across the free throw lane, and he came to me and he said, "Bill, if you like Charlie, you better tell him not to go downtown. Dogtail, town cop, 2 guns, threatens to blow him away if he catches him out there with her." What I learned most about was how much people did not know about my culture, our ways of life, just an absence of understanding. In segregation, whether it's a wall, concrete, or the segregation that comes with the kind of social structure where we exclude in a fairly thorough way, they both serve to perpetuate incredibly vicious stereotypes. I conducted my first research on school desegregation in 1968 as a research assistant on the 1968 Civil Rights Survey. I'd just begun my graduate studies in sociology at GW. And in that work, we collected the reports of Southern school districts that were reporting to us regarding their progress in desegregating their schools. That was under mandatory school desegregation, where we actually did see some school desegregation. Even then, the resistance was clear as principals deliberately listed their white students as minorities, as Black students, and did other acts of misreporting that bedeviled our research. So we would have to spend hours on the phone with Southern school officials to clean those reports. Among the lessons I learned from the personal and professional experience, 2 stand out quite clearly. First, there's a fundamental difference between desegregation and integration. The latter requires a great deal more intentional work than we have been committed to. Second, the salience of race and the multiple ways in which it manifests itself in education are often underestimated. These are the sources of lessons and the big takeaways from my experiences. They have formed the basis for how I think about school desegregation, how I have framed my analyses of school district data, and how I interpret or try to make sense of what I see in the data. And they are the engine for this talk. So let's look at some of the racial composition effects. Try it now? Okay. Good. Still not? Depending on how you want to think about it, you're really not missing a whole lot by not hearing Almond's words. Okay. Okay. Right. Thank you. So the demographic change is real. The demographic imperative has happened. We now have a growing list of counties in America that are majority minority. First grade across the nation is majority minority. We're not going to change that. That's going to happen and continue to happen. I know there are some folks in this in this era who think they're going to slow that process significantly, but that demographic imperative is real. these populations are going to grow. What's important to see is that our tendency to create these categories as monolithic, all being the same, is really inaccurate. And it's an inappropriate way of characterizing the population of students. Puerto Rican population, different from other populations that are under the flag of Hispanic. Most of you know these things and how they impact students and the quality of their lives. The percentage of the Asian population under 18 years old born within the United States by subgroup. This is real. These are the people who will be our neighbors. These are the people that we have to worry about making sure they're trained well so they have enough jobs to pay for my Social Security and yours. It's a matter of enlightened self-interest, folks. We can either choose to do our best for the children who come to us, or we can suffer the consequences. We can suffer the consequences of having poorly trained people who will provide our medical services. Insufficiently trained people. Freeman Roboski has one of the best answers to this. He has his students repeat chemistry and biology courses when they get a B, because he does not want to go to a doctor who got a B in chemistry. You should hear him tell the story. But I think we've got to start thinking like that. We've got to start thinking about issues like these. The percentage of children under age 18 in families living in poverty. Now, a lot of this is going to dwell on this issue of poverty. Sean Reardon has done some excellent work in helping us understand the relationship of poverty to racial composition of schools and communities. Sean's disaggregation of how we think about it, he actually has a paper starts with about 32 different categories. One of the findings that I think is pretty seminal, and he got a shout out from William Julius Wilson on this, is that it's about the poverty that's in the context that the children are in. It's not just about the poverty that the child, him or herself, may be living in, but also about the poverty of the neighborhood, the poverty of the other students in the classroom. It's that kind of poverty concentration that really makes a difference. How about a parallel finding from a study that looks at black males? And that study talks about the importance of understanding that black students in communities where there are males present, not necessarily the fathers themselves, not necessarily the fathers themselves, those communities have healthier performing children. That's pretty profound. And William Julius Wilson shouted out to him, at last we have some evidence that doesn't indict those families, that doesn't hearken back to Moynihan's The Negro Family in talking about the pathologies in our households. It actually begins to shift the conversation in a healthier way. The percentage of children under age 18 in families living in poverty based on the official poverty measure by race, ethnicity for 2000 through 2014. The housing boom pushed a lot of people over the edge. That housing bust, I'm sorry. When we went through that financial experience, that we had a really bright, smart, huge intellect president guide us through. The evidence from that shows that the recovery that we were making still not enough to prevent the numbers of families that have dipped into poverty. And that's a fundamental concern. The percentage of children under age 18 in families living in poverty by race, ethnicity, and the type of poverty measure. We have two types of poverty measures. One, the one that we're accustomed to, and the other, which is adjusted for benefits, after-tax benefits, and so on. So the adjusted, but you can look at these and you can still see that, it's all right. You can still see the distribution there. Children under 18 living in poverty by race and ethnicity in 2014. Look at the growth. We can do better than this. We need to do better than this. Look at the distribution across different Hispanic groups. 2014. Many of these are the children who are in elementary and middle school classrooms now, some in high school. And I'll get to try to make some sense of that and the implications. Same for Asians. This is the diversity that is here in America. This is the diversity for those of you who worry about concerns about access. This is the diversity that will be impacting our freshman classes in the not too distant future. We have to think about smart policies that will address the kind of poverty that these kids are growing up in and some of the consequences of that poverty. So changes in the percentage of high poverty schools comprised of mostly Black and Hispanic students, selected school years, 2000 to 2013-14. We've increased the percentage of high poverty schools that have high concentrations of Black and Hispanic students. Now let's just think about that for a minute. Those schools are likely to be under-resourced, have high teacher turnover rates, have high rates of absenteeism, both on the part of teachers and students, and, according to recent GAO reports, are likely to have substantially important need for repair and replacement. Those are the schools that are in community tax areas where the tax base isn't ample enough. My hometown is one of those cities. Richmond, Virginia, the median household income is $17,000 a year. Now, when you look at that area, you don't necessarily recognize it because Hanover is just outside. Well, Hanover and Richmond, that's what you call between district segregation. And it is severe. High poverty in Richmond and high Black and Hispanic population, just the opposite, mainly whites in Hanover County. We have to be concerned about that disparity from federal policy, state policy, local policy. We need to be fashioning the kind of research that informs those persons about the children who are experiencing that. Changes in the percentage of students who attend high poverty schools of mostly Black and Hispanic students compared to the percentage of students who attend other schools. One of the things I did was to revisit some of the court cases where I'd been an expert witness. And what I had been glossing over and not attending to very much was the fact that in some instances, the resident population of white students wasn't insignificant at all. But when I looked at the enrollment difference for actual enrollment in the public schools, they were under-enrolled in the public schools because they were going to private schools and other Catholic schools. That's important for us to think about. They are increasingly leaving public schools. There was a sign up outside of West Champaign during the consent decree. The sign said, Muhammad Schools, Champaign address. What were they trying to communicate? Was just informed by one of my students that a community of Korean students and families are moving to Muhammad. One of the things we do as a society is to help people understand the kind of racism that we practice as quickly as we can. Our students, graduate students, come to us and within a matter of weeks, they know what parts of town to avoid. They know where not to go. That's because we help them learn how we practice this stuff. That's a part of the definition of an institution. It's the rules we apply to bring order to our lives. Changes in the percent of high poverty schools of mostly Black or Hispanic students by school type. Charter schools, magnet schools, traditional public schools. Now understand one of the things that happens when students and families move from move from traditional public schools to charter and magnet schools. I did a paper once that called it the decapitalization of our public schools. It's not just the financial capital that leaves, but it's the social capital. It's the social networks that Bill Trent and his family have, where we can find resources to improve a school play that the kids want to put on. We can find ways to facilitate a field trip over to the University of Illinois. But when we leave students and teachers without some meaningful supports and assistance that would make their teaching of our children infinitely better. Changes in the percentage, so we've increased the number of schools that have those attributes, but we're also increasing the number of students who are in those schools. The change from 2001 to 2013-14. Why does it matter? Why does it matter? It matters because even Bill Trent and his schoolmates back in 1961, 62 could take college algebra, trig, and analytic geometry in my high school. We took it from B. Harrington, who was slightly taller than this podium. And when she finished teaching us, at the end of the day, she walked 3 blocks down the street and taught at Virginia Union University. I suspect she taught many of the same kinds of courses. Now, she terrorized me. But I had those courses. And look at the number of kids who are not in schools that even offer those courses. That's structural inequality. It does not need to exist. We're better than that. Science courses. I think we actually had almost a Bunsen burner for every student in our class. 37 kids who were tracked together. I know there are some friends in the room who graduated from the other high school across town, and I'm so tempted to ask whether or not they had. It's the other Black high school in town, but I won't name it. Percentage of schools offering advanced placement courses and gifted and talented courses. These are courses that put students on track to be able to attend the University of Illinois, Harvard, Brown, Yale, University of Miami. Got to call out Joe back there. UCLA. It's about preparing students to be college ready. And here's one that sort of puts a cap on why that's important. Most of you work in places where the admissions office has a yield list, right? That's where we send our recruiters because we're going to get a higher yield from those places in terms of applicants, in terms of quality of applicants, and in terms of applicants who can pay. The schools are both whiter and wealthier. Public school enrollment by race, 1968, 2011. What's significant there is we know who's leaving them. Here's another way of thinking about it. The black-white student achievement and achievement gap. And this is one of those issues I was talking about the improvement in our measurement and our specificity. I'm going to get to another slide later where I'm going to talk about why African American communities were pursuing school desegregation if the quality was as high as I have said it was. We weren't looking for better teachers. We had those. But this issue is more important than simply better teachers. This is an issue about citizenship. These are our rights. One of my best friends, one of your colleagues who does research on this bit about higher education, John Williams. John Williams and I started going together in the 4th grade because he couldn't go to Ivy Norrell High School, which was a block and a half down the street from his house. So he went to Baker Street Elementary School, along with probably another whole class of 4th graders. That's when we started attending school together. Those are very real experiences. So we have to think about this not just in terms of the quality of education. That's extremely important. Because not all schools have the same available tax base and monetary support and financial support that's necessary in order to provide the courses, the instruction, the kinds of materials that are available. And the gaps are different in these spaces once you control for a variety of factors. This is probably not going to play. So I'm supposed to...
Our continuing series, What's Working, looks at the innovations that are paying off in America, from education to infrastructure and more. Research finds that when students change schools, they're more likely to be less engaged. That could lower their grades and increase the risk they will drop out of high school. Students generally lose about 3 months of reading and math with each transfer. Mark Strassman shows us a promising new program for low-income students and their families at school in Atlanta. It's cut the student turnover rate nearly in half. Mark, good morning.
Good morning. This is Thomasville Heights Elementary School, historically a failing school in Atlanta. But there's been a turnaround here. Turnover is down, attendance and test scores are both up. And it all started when parents and their kids lawyered up. When Nicole Evans-Jones became principal here 2 years ago, she inherited a crisis. Thomasville Heights Elementary has at times been the worst performing elementary school in all of Georgia and one of its poorest.
I have students, that have been in 4 or 5 schools by 2nd grade or so.
So the class that starts on day 1 can look very different than the class that finishes the year.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like 40% of the kids in that class might not be there at the end of the year.
They knew they had to address that problem, and we thought we had a solution.
Michael Lucas helps lead the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, a group that gets attorneys to fight for free on behalf of low-income tenants. He traced the Thomasville Heights turnover problem right across the street to the Forest Cove apartments. 95% of the school's students live here. It's Section 8 subsidized housing. Families kept moving in and out of here because they had no choice. A combination of wrongful evictions or deplorable conditions that never seemed to get fixed. The solution? Embed a tenant rights lawyer inside the school's front office. A free walk-in resource for parents.
Really, I get to be a lawyer in a school helping parents and families stay in the school zone to get the benefit of the school.
Lawyer Ayanna Jones-Lightsey says right away, new clients kept walking in the door.
So these folks come in. What kind of issues are they having?
It's more a question of what kind of issues aren't they having? My ceiling fell in this weekend from a leak that I've been telling my landlord about for months. My oven doesn't work, hasn't worked for weeks.
These folks are coming to you with issues that are violations of the law.
Yes.
And they need a lawyer.
Yes.
And they can't afford one.
Yes.
Lolita Evans and her 4 kids live at Forest Cove, sick from the mold that grew inside their apartment. Her complaints went nowhere until she showed up with her new lawyer.
What kind of a difference did it make?
A whole lot different. I had a whole SWAT team come to my door. They came right in and went to work and fixed everything in one day.
One day?
One day.
And you've been waiting for how long?
About a year.
Her lawyer was Jones-Lightsey.
What kind of an adjustment was it for the landlord to realize the tenant had a lawyer?
I think it's still an adjustment. And these tenants don't just have me, they have lawyers from the top law firms in Atlanta.
But they know you mean business.
Yes, one of my tenants says, you know, Ayanna, don't play. That's her phrase for it.
Last year, the program's first year here, the lawyers stopped 20 evictions. They took on over 80 cases involving conflicts with the complex management.
I've had tenants cry in court because they knew they had a story and they knew they had a right, but they didn't think they would be able to articulate it and win.
Dr. Jones says student turnover here dropped from 40% to 25%.
It's huge. Yes, I mean, we still have a long way to go, obviously, but it's a great start in first year.
There's some far-reaching, really human impacts of this affordable housing crisis, and I hope that other communities will take a closer look at those impacts.
Jayana, please come forward.
Lolita Evans can tell you about the impact. We were there as her kids, Jayana, a 4th grader, and Robert, a 2nd grader, received awards as Students of the Month. In the first year of the program, standardized test scores went up 50%. No one's calling it a miracle turnaround, but it's a solid start. For CBS This Morning, Mark Strausman, Atlanta.
There are things we can do. We're not without the ability to have these sorts of influences. We can reduce the amount of disruption. The state of Virginia is one of the states that doesn't have renter rights. 5 of the top cities for eviction rates are in the state of Virginia. My hometown, the rate is 1 in 5. Now imagine that a school district has to reroute their buses in order to keep that child going to the same classroom for an entire semester. That's a heck of a lot of planning and resource utilization. But it may be necessary. When you think about kids having how many? 5, 6, 10 different schools in the course of an academic year, and the kid is how old? 8, 9? That's really disruptive. So we have to think about what are these correlates of poverty that really do impact student performance. You know the effect of missed seat time. So absenteeism, suspensions and expulsions, all of those are impactful in reducing the learning that our children experience. So the correlates of spatial variation in upward mobility. Chetty has done some very interesting work, economics of education. Now, if you're a sociologist, I just want you to know, it takes me a long time to get around to thinking that economists have done some really interesting theoretical work. That's the joke, folks. But we now know that his work has identified 5 attributes of places that contribute positively to mobility. Guess what one of them is? Lower levels of segregation. Lower levels of segregation. Effect of low poverty schools on the math scores of children in public housing. Racial composition of public school enrollment in the United States, 1970 to 2013. Why is it so important that we have to find ways of enhancing the performance and capacity of public education? It's because I don't have a social contract with Walmart. Walmart can pack up tomorrow and leave me. But I have a social contract. As long as I have my citizen rights. So a lot of this resistance is really about citizenship, in my estimation. It's about the exercise of the franchise. Because like the kid said 2 Saturdays ago, what did he tell one of those senators? I hope when you pick up your check, you're going to come put it in your retirement account because we're voting you out. We have to vote our best interests. We have to vote for people who have a vision of the performance of public education that would create the capacity for those schools to serve our children better, to serve our children like my schools served me. I can name almost every one of my elementary school teachers and every one of my high school teachers. That's how I felt about my school. How many of our kids feel that way about their schools? Percentage of low-income students in schools attended by the average student of each race. Black student learning was never about who was sitting next to me in the literal sense. There was not going to be any lateral transfer of intellect. It just wasn't going to happen. We used to joke about that. We really did. And people who used to say, yeah, integration failed. And people would say, well, when did we try it? So we have a lot of work to do. As a social science community, as researchers and as scholars, we have to continue the work of trying to flesh out what integration ought to look like. Okay. Depending on how much that young lady is smiling, I don't know how much time I have left. The percentage of black students in the South who attend schools that are at least 50% white. And this is, again, this is this issue of contact. This is this issue of isolation versus. Now, one of the things that's a concern to me, and I think it ought to be a concern to all of us, is just conceptually, why have we allowed historically majority-minority schools to be a problem, but not majority white schools? Why is a majority white school not a racially identifiable school? Our very language, the very way we talk about this, privileges a structure that doesn't facilitate the kind of change that we need. And the assumption is that they don't suffer from the ravages of segregation. But we're going to raise some questions about that. Most of these you know because you see the schools your children are in, your family members attend, and you have a sense also because of the way your neighborhoods change. More and more poor, predominantly minority schools. Charter schools have grown and become more segregated. how segregation changed between communities versus inside communities. Now, this is an interesting one. This issue of ethnoburbs, and early on I had mentioned the idea that we needed to continue to unpack some of the motivations for segregation. Well, it turns out that there is a community of people who are a little bit concerned about the efficacy of meritocracy. So there are whites that are leaving highly diverse suburbs or ethnoburbs and moving out, even after building relatively brand new homes. And it's happening across the country. Cupertino, over in California. Why are they moving? They are moving because they think those tiger moms are pushing too hard. So they are moving and establishing new smaller towns where they have greater assurance that their children will be at the top rank. Okay? That's a real interesting twist on meritocracy. All that hard work and sacrifice and fairness, let's move. And they're literally making charges, similar to the charges they made about us, but different category. I don't want my children to have those kinds of mental pressures. And so we had an incident at University of Illinois. Probably none of you heard about it, I hope. There's a bus company that's not a part of the university, but their ad that they ran said, ride our bus back to Chicago and you won't feel like you, I forget the exact wordage, but you won't, that you're in China. So you know, when it gets to the point where a functioning business concern can just sort of out it like that, you know how that story has been passing amongst parents. So we're getting segregation of a sort where whites are resegregating themselves in order to avoid, not contact with us, but they don't want the competition. Don't enjoy the heat in the kitchen. We have to understand, given the demographic imperative that we have been experiencing, that we are going to experience, that needs to stop. That needs to stop. They do not need to be continuing to persist in communities where those distortions, sort of the allegory of the cave, where you're constantly looking at shadows of things, not the reality, where you don't know the reality because you're not in association with it. So, most districts keep segregation levels literally about the same as their underlying neighborhoods. So this issue of segregation is real. We're experiencing the consequences of it, but there are ways in which we can address it. You saw the example of the attorney in the public housing. We still have legal recourse that we can pursue with respect to changing certain public policies, like not having renters protected in the state of Virginia. 5 of the top cities in terms of evictions are literally in that one state. So we can do that. But we also want to ask the question, why we want to do it. So I remember from various discussions that I have on campus with people who are avid readers. This is from James Baldwin. And I want you to take your time and read through that. Because if I'm not what I've been told I am, then it means that you're not what you thought you were either. And that is the crisis. So these distortions that can grow and persist are not one-sided. It's not the conversation that people had about Ralph Ellison having internalized too much of the segregation, wondering if in fact he were doing it right based on the white models. That was the critique. But we don't have to think about it that way. So it's not just that we benefit from knowing our history and the history of this country. The people who hacked our computers made great use of our insecurities about race and racism. Martin Luther King, he concluded with the words that he is convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other. This has become one of my favorite quotes. Does the Negro need separate schools? And the answer is no. I work in a college of teacher education, and my colleague over there knows that I sent this quote to him, and I asked him, are these the attributes we're instilling in the teachers we're producing? Yes. He's good like that. Whenever the shoe gets tight and squeezes, he opens up. Segregation prevents us from knowing each other. Knowing each other in that intuitive way, knowing each other in that way that produces care, produces empathy. I have a 4-year-old grandson who's going to be 5 next month. I want him to have that teacher. I want him to have a teacher who listens to him, who knows him and his circumstances, his context. Such contact between pupils and between teacher and pupil on the basis of perfect social equality as will increase this sympathy and knowledge. Facilities, we need those. For education in equipment and housing, and the promotion of such extracurricular activities which will tend to conduct the child into life. And if we make that say into democratic life, it's entirely possible that we might not be having some of the kinds of experiences and discussions at the national level that we're having now. This is a highly moral education in some of the most important ways. And I'll close with sharing just one last story. And that is that in producing the volume Compelling Interest, we had this discussion about how to frame it. And what was on the table was how well would the moral argument sell? And so the losing side was told that the courts aren't going to buy it. I think we have to be willing to stand on strong moral ground until the courts buy it. Thank you very much for your patience and attention. Thank you very much. Questions? Sure.
Hello. White folks are running away in their schools. So what? I ain't chasing them. What we need are resources. I don't need to sit in a classroom with a white person. I need the debt that is owed to me, my ancestors, and my descendants. If we keep on pushing black kids into white schools, white curriculum, white hate, are we not pushing them into a burning building?
It's a very... I don't have any opposition to what that critique raises. I really don't. I'm a father, 4 daughters, lived in Washington, D.C. I was also something of an activist when I was first there. And so I was very supportive of the public schools. And we tried hard to keep our kids in public school. But we made the change. And this is personal. This doesn't have to be anybody else's answer, because each of you will have to address this issue yourself. For me, I wanted my daughters to have an excellent chance of growing up and being able to make a comparable decision, if not the same one, independent of me. Not because I made that decision for them. So I had to find a way to have them educated in such a way that would equip them when they got to that question point, equip them to make a decision about what they were going to do. And it's not just the schools that you put the kids in. I grew up in an old family. And this is an interesting thing to admit out loud. One of my child care keepers, when I did half day, Chris is laughing, he knows this, was a wino named High Pockets. High Pockets would watch me until my mother, who was a domestic, would get off the bus and come check on me, pick me up and walk me home. She trusted High Pockets. So when when we started looking for a church, I wanted to find a church that had some of High Pockets' relatives in it, whether we were living in D.C. or whether we were living in Champaign. And the reason is because I didn't want my children to grow up thinking that people who looked like High Pockets, walked like High Pockets, sounded like High Pockets weren't good people. One of the most frightening experiences I had was one of my daughters came home and said, "Daddy, if you only want us to play with good kids, we'll probably never have a black male friend." Imagine hearing that. That here's one of my daughters telling me that they ain't looking for nobody to look like me. The teachers, just as you're saying, those schools were teaching those children those lessons by how they administered punishment and discipline in the classrooms. So you're right, we have taught whole communities not to trust schools. One of the biggest things I've found in doing litigation work on K-12 schools is that a lot of black communities have given up trusting. And they have every reason to. The number of times that they've been promised and the promise has been broken, the debt hasn't been paid, it's huge. So I can't tell you how to answer the question. I can only tell you that there are a lot of parents who are likely going to have to answer that question. This starts because of the quality of educational experience we want kids to have. If your kid can't get a quality educational experience, this one, in an all-black school, I would say move him. If your kid can get it in a mixed school, take it. Because this will help that child develop, in my estimation. But you got to answer that question on your own. I don't know what the real public policy issue is on this. And I don't know if we can come up with all of the different sophisticated measurements to plumb deeply into this, but I know we need to, because we got a lot of parents who are asking that question. We're training a lot of kids to the PhD faculty level, and they're not going to work in Chicago, New York, DC, Louisiana, and those places where they're going to find that affinity. They're going to work in places like Holland, Michigan. That's a problem. So I think we have to come to grips with these issues. And it's not just, again, I don't think it's just the issue of compliance with the letter of the law. We've increasingly got to convince people to comply with the spirit of the law. I'm sorry to go on so long about responding to it.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm a native Washingtonian. And I'm
sorry to trash you
also
down.
The grandson of George E.C. Hayes, who was one of the lead attorneys in the Brown decision. And my father, who did a lot of work in this area, was J.K. Smith, who was the dean of Howard Law School for many years. So what I want to ask you is that we've seen, and I'm glad as a sociologist that you sort of talked down the Coleman report. And we've always have been between this crossroad between Coleman and Edmonds. Mm-hmm. And Edmonds showed that high poverty, high minority schools can achieve, and we've seemed to abandon that. Why do you think we've abandoned that notion? And we're so amazed when we go into some of these schools to see the achievement at these levels. If we just do what Edmonds told us to do and look at these correlates and really making sure that they're there and kids are performing. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. One of the ways that I've been thinking about it is that I don't know that any of us are immune to the messages. The messages about privatization. The messages about charters being better. Now, some of us who have read the studies and know better and know where the errors were. You know, for example, when Reagan was coming into office, it was at the same time that the second major Coleman report was being done, high school and beyond. One entire issue of the sociology of education, am I right, Joe, was devoted to the analysis of those data. It came back saying that Catholic schools did it better, private schools did it better, even for children of color. Now, here's the questionable part. Coleman used a synthetic cohort analysis. I'll tell you what that is. That's when you take the sample of kids who were in the 8th grade and you match them on any number of variables to students who were in the 12th grade, and you treat that 12th grade cohort as if it's the 8th grade cohort grown up. So they ran a reanalysis. Almost none of the original findings held up. Now, there were some fairly basic reasons for that. Number one, most public schools take all comers. What you find in private schools are that top 35%. Jinks and Phillips. If you read the opening chapter in that book, I'm slipping on the title of it. But the opening chapter summarizes saying black and white kids who have exposure to the same AP courses, there is no statistically different performance when you compare the two. The problem is we don't provide access to the students who are black and Latino, to students of color, in being able to have those experiences where they can be successful in those AP courses. That's the challenge. We can do better. And you're right. We have to find a way to fund those schools, irrespective of the racial composition of the schools. And it's the public schools where we have the opportunity to push the lever. That's where our social contract is supposed to work. But we have to show up at the polls, and we have to make sure that they know what kind of people we want serving the interests of our families, our children, our communities. You had a question? Did you have a question?
Me? Yeah.
Yes.
So as you're laying out some of the pieces of what a broader agenda around desegregation and integration are, it strikes me that it's a little bit out of sync with how academic researchers or education researchers do their work. We do so much work that isolates us intellectually because of specialization, which is really like the agenda of whiteness, to get us to focus on our work and not think about the broader picture. So how do you tell a room full of people who do research, what is the practical advice for sort of breaking out of that isolation so that we can start to see the different pieces that are, you can't work on race and enrollment in isolation, and you can't work on resources in isolation. You have to see the whole picture. It has to be both, right?
It does, and good. I have had the blessing of having incredible colleagues. I really have. In terms of smart people that I've worked with, in terms of people who care about particular sorts of problems. And so those places have been like incubators. It doesn't take a whole army. Joe Mills didn't have a whole army when he was working on developing the contact hypothesis into the perpetuation theory. It wasn't a whole army. But we used to have a Wednesday brown bag that was as good as any seminar we could find. And had really bright people sitting at the table thinking about it. And so I think a lot of our places will accommodate lunch over sandwiches you make at home if you're going to talk about important issues that they care about. And I do think that, what's the name of the book? Sociological Imagination, where what he encourages us to do is to not ignore our own lives in terms of it being a source of important questions, our own experiences. You're gonna make me wish there was something else in this glass. I can't answer that question for others. I finished my doctorate at Chapel Hill, and I was invited to apply for a position at UNC Durham. There are a lot of things that go into responding to those kinds of opportunities. I think a number of us, we are not averse to doing that, not at all. But what we do realize is that there are severe, not at all, but there are severe infrastructure challenges in many of those places. There are colleagues that I work with now, and we're doing some work at Chicago State. Chicago State in Illinois was one of the many schools in the state that didn't have a budget for 2 years. There was no state allocation. Chicago State graduated six bachelor's degrees in physics. Do they have an outstanding graduation completion rate? No. But they have pockets of excellence that are superb. And part of the work we do is to make sure that places like that get to survive, but hopefully to do more than survive and actually be able to grow. We have, I think, a number of HBCUs that are in precarious situations because of governors who don't want to pay for what they consider duplication. And we have to prevent that. These are still places that do a lot of the heavy lifting with producing those blacks and women who are in STEM fields, whether it's in math and other areas. So I can't answer the question for others, and I don't think any of us are opposed to it. But it's also important that those of us who can have access to these places, like the argument in the shape of the river, we have to be in some of those places where we can actually endorse some of the ideas that women and other scholars of color have that might not get supported or endorsed in places like my university, but for folks like Chris, Jim, and others who listen to those students and say, well, we can work on that idea. You can do that, it matters. So I think it's not either or, but I really think a lot of us have to be in both places, but certainly in places that are conduits to positions of influence and opportunities where you can shape the agenda differently. And that's something that we have to take seriously. You pay a price for being in there, shaping that agenda differently. It's not an all easy ride, but it needs to be done still. The context of those places. They have some of the nation's best resources. And our students should have access to those. And so a part of what we do is to try to make that happen.